Welcome, everyone. Today's session on native plants and bees is part of the Let's Grow Together 10-Minute University webinar series. Our speaker, Jen Hayes, is a PhD candidate in Oregon State University's Horticulture Department. Jen has studied pollinators in Vermont, Ecuador, North Dakota, and Oregon. I'm so glad she came to Oregon. I'm delighted Jen will be sharing what her research in Oregon has revealed in the relationship involving native plants, native R plants, and native bees. Welcome, Jen.
Hello. Figuring out which keys are going to work for slide advancing. Okay, here we go. Yeah, thanks for the intro, Sherry. My name is Jen. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a grad student. I did my undergrad at the University of Vermont studying blueberries and raspberries and the services that native pollinators provide for them. And in 2019, I started grad school here at OSU. And today we're going to talk a lot about native plants and how they relate to bees, how they compare to native cultivars. And then the last section of my talk today, we're going to spend a little more time getting into some details about cultivars. So to start and make sure we're on the same page, I wanted to provide the definition that we use for a native plant. And so native plants are the indigenous, terrestrial, and aquatic species that have evolved and occur naturally in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat. Species native to North America are generally recognized as those that have occurred on the continent prior to European settlement, and they represent a number of different life forms, including conifers, hardwoods, shrubs, grasses, etc. And people vary in the scale that they use to determine a plant's native status. So here, the native range of Clarkia amoena is depicted in green on the map. And while technically you could say this plant is native to North America or the Pacific Northwest, it isn't found across the entirety of those scales. So even in Oregon, you're unlikely to come across the plant in the central and eastern portions of the state. So scale is really important when talking about native plants. Moving right on to bees. So while bees come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, many people are only familiar with a handful of bee species, such as honeybees and bumblebees. And it's important to note that these species are not representative of all bees. Honeybees, for example, are not native to the United States, and they're managed as agricultural livestock. Most native bee species are not managed, and their conservation concerns are often very different from those of honeybees. So bees have diverse life histories and therefore they have different needs. So based on their native status, whether they're social, solitary, or somewhere in between, the different nesting strategies they have, and the different feeding strategies they have. So we're going to explore a few of those needs today as they relate to plants. So what do bees get from plants? Perhaps most importantly, bees get food from plants. So nectar is a combination of sugar and water, which offers bees a source of hydration and energy. If you want to help hydrate bees, you don't need to put out those little bowls with marbles. You can just provide them with plants that produce nectar. Pollen is a source of protein, fat, and nutrients for bees, and it's eaten by some adult bees, but it's primarily collected for their larvae to eat. Some bees also collect floral oils, which can be used for larval provisions as well. So, plants may also be important as nest sites for bees. Around 30% of bees nest in cavities, which can be provided by plant stems, old logs, etc. Or others may have aerial nests that they use by attaching them to plants. And plants can also serve to provide protection over nesting areas in the ground or in other surfaces. Bees also collect many non-food resources from plants, which are typically used to help build their nests. So things like sticks. This bottom left photo shows a bumblebee carrying a stick. It's called the witch bee. Um, and they also may collect plant hairs like wool carder bees in the center photo here, or resin from trees in the top right. A favorite example of mine that is neither shelter nor food actually comes from orchid bees, so that green bee in the bottom. And male orchid bees actually collect fragrances from flowers that they use to make a little perfume that they then use to help attract females for mating. So we're going to talk about native plants moving forward and how they might differ from another type of plant. So native plants provide the same resources to bees that we've just discussed, but they may be beneficial for other reasons as well. So while non-native bee species benefit from native plants, these next examples are of particular importance for native bees. So native bees benefit from the evolutionary and geographic history that they share with native plants. These benefits can include things like phenology or timing. So think of when camellias bloom. This photo was taken in February, which is several months from peak bee activity. And while it may seem obvious that if you're trying to plant for pollinators, something that blooms in the winter might not be the best choice, timing can be incredibly important for bees, most of which have very short lifespans. So in deserts, the emergence of some bee species is actually induced by exposure to high humidity or rainfall. So this indicates that their host plants have begun germinating. So in environments with few floral resources, the synchronous emergence of bees and flowers is often essential for their survival. Native plants may also be a better fit morphologically than some exotic plant species. So bumblebees have longer tongues than honeybees, which makes accessing nectar in blueberry flowers a lot easier for them. Honeybees are even known to nectar rob from blueberry flowers, where they'll make a little hole in the base of the corolla to access the nectar instead of going in through the quote unquote front door of the plant. And blueberries are also a great example because they have what are called parietal anthers. And so essentially they hide their pollen inside of the flower's anthers, as opposed to something like lilies, where if you have them in a vase, you're probably very familiar with the pollen that readily falls off of those anthers. So in blueberries, to access the pollen, bees have to shake the anthers through buzz pollination, which is also called sonication. So around 50% of native bees sonicate, which allows them to vibrate flowers and access their rewards. So this pollen then may be actually better preserved for native species to access. Different bee species visit different plants, and their diet may actually require them to visit native plants. So we define diet based on pollen foraging, since it's a more specialized food source than nectar, and so far nectar specialization has not been documented in bees. So bees have either specialist or generalist diets. Specialists collect pollen from a narrow range of plant species. So this may be as specific as a couple of species or as broad as only a couple of plant families. On the other end, we have generalists, which collect pollen from 4 or more different plant families. So an example of a specialist is the longhorned bee Melissodes clarkiae, which is a specialist on the genus Clarkia. So these bees will only collect pollen from plants within the Clarkia genus. But again, they may collect nectar from a much larger variety of plants. On the generalist side, we have most bumblebees, where they are going to be observed collecting both pollen and nectar from a really large variety of plants. Native plants are important for bee conservation. So research has suggested that the inclusion of native plants in pollinator plantings can expand the abundance and the diversity of the bee community that a garden can support, in addition to supporting specialist species. So while generalists may be able to forage from a really wide variety of plants, it's really important to have native plants to support native specialist bees, which have only a few plants that they can collect pollen from. I'm going to share some plants for pollinators based on Erin Anderson's research, which is also published in an extension article that's referenced here. And so don't try to take notes. You can jot down the name or the number of this extension article if you want, but if you registered for this webinar in advance, you will be getting a document that has all of the resources that I show here. So don't try to scramble and write everything down. And I want to note that when we are figuring out what plants are good for bees, we usually consider abundance or the total number of bees found on a plant, as well as the diversity or the number of different species found on a plant. So the best plants are typically those that support a high diversity, not just a high abundance of bees. And so Erin's research looked at bee visitation to 23 different Pacific Northwest native plants. And these plants were in the top 10 based on their abundance and diversity. They're not placed in any particular order here, but we have things like Phacelia and Gilia, California poppy, Douglas aster and Clarkia, which I will talk about incessantly today. Madia, Oregon Sunshine, Goldenrod, Rose Checker Mallow, and Yarrow. And if we were to order them, here we have a high abundance all the way to the left. So an example of a plant that typically has a high abundance of bees is lavender, which isn't native, but it's a plant a lot of people are familiar with and tend to think of it as a pollinator plant because it typically is covered in bees in the summer. And so while it might be buzzing, it typically only has a couple of bees visiting it. Versus on the other end of this list here, we have yarrow, which is visited by a ton of different bee species, although at a much lower abundance. Moving towards the middle are plants that have a high abundance and a high diversity of bees. And to be clear, any of the plants that are listed in this top 10 would be great additions to a garden. The point that I really want to emphasize is that when you're selecting plants for your garden, you want to make sure that you are selecting plants that support an abundance and a diversity of bee species. The plants that we just looked at were annuals or perennials, and most of them were primarily native to Western Oregon. So for any folks joining from Central and Eastern Oregon, I wanted to highlight a couple of plants here for you as well. So yarrow and goldenrod are broadly native in Oregon. Rabbit brush is another really great pollinator plant. east of the Cascades. And that recommendation actually comes from the Oregon Bee Atlas. And then for everyone in Oregon, I wanted to point out another extension document which explores shrubs and trees for bees in Oregon. And that's based off of Scott Mitchell's graduate research. So a lot of these species are probably familiar: madrone, hawthorns, and willows, manzanita, chokecherry, as well as ceanothus. And again, these are resources available online and in some documentation that'll be sent out after my talk. So moving forward here, we're going to talk about the focus of my thesis research, which is native plants and native cultivars. So a visual example of a native cultivar. On the far left, we have Farewell to Spring, Clarkia amoena, the wild type. And then to the right are 3 cultivars of that species. And so typically we can identify a cultivar because it'll have the scientific name of a plant followed by a name in single quotation marks. Sometimes you'll have a full scientific name like Clarkia amoena maiden blush pink, or sometimes it'll just have the genus. And so if it's just the genus in front of the plant name, that usually indicates that it's a interspecific hybrid or that the parents come from 2 different species. There have been several studies across the United States that have explored the use of native plants and native cultivars by pollinators, but the results tend to be mixed in terms of whether they find cultivars more, less, or equally supportive of pollinators as wild-type native plants. So we have people who have looked at perennials, shrubs, some very specific groups like milkweed and phlox. And again, that's where this scale component comes in. So what about bee visitation to Pacific Northwest native plants and cultivars? So no study had been done in this region yet. So that was the goal of my research, to fill the gap in our understanding about bee visitation to native plants and cultivars in this part of the country. And so for my project, we selected plants that had commercially available cultivars. We included 3 perennial plants, which are listed in the top here, as well as 2 annual plants in the bottom row. And the cultivars represent an array of plant breeding strategies. So some of them are interspecific hybrids, and some of them are selected from wild populations. A few examples here. We have yarrow in the top, where both of its cultivars are interspecific hybrids. So is the columbine cultivar we list here. Douglas aster had both of its cultivars selected from wild populations. And then California poppy and Farewell to Spring, we have a bit of a variety of colors in those different annual plants. So for 3 years, we looked at pollinator visitation to our study plants in an experimental garden in Corvallis, and we used 2 primary metrics to quantify visitation. So the first was observations, where we would sit and watch a plant and record the types of bees and the number of bees that visited a plant over a 5-minute period. We did this at least once a week when plants had at least 25% of their plot in bloom. And then our second method was collection. So we used a vacuum, interestingly, to sample the bees that were actively foraging on plants. We vacuumed until no bees were left on a certain plant, and then we took them back to the lab where we were able to identify them to species and to sex. For our observations, we grouped bees into 5 categories in an attempt to understand visitation by bees with different life histories. So honeybees, as we've talked about, they're social and non-native. Bumblebees are social and native. Longhorned bees are solitary and they have a high rate of specialization. Leafcutter bees are distinct in that they carry pollen on the underside of their abdomen, and they're typically cavity nesting bees. And then we have other bees, which is kind of an amalgamation of the bees that we couldn't easily identify from one another in the field, which includes things like sweat bees and parasitic bees, which also represent some other life history traits. So using those 5 bee groups and all of our plants down at the bottom, we're going to build a heat map here to show you the results of our comparisons. So we compared visitation by each bee group between the native plant in each of our plant groups and each of the respective cultivars. So a green box will indicate that a comparison that specific group of bees had a preference for the native plant. White will indicate there was no statistically significant difference between the 2 plant types. And then the purple will indicate a preference for the cultivar. And so we'll populate that here. So really variable here. As we can see, there wasn't any difference for any of the California poppies. Some of our plant groups had quite a few significant differences, like the Douglas aster and the Farewell to Spring, and then Yarrow Columbine only had a couple of differences. So interestingly, the cultivars were only preferred outside of the Douglas aster on 2 occasions. So honeybees preferred the Salmon Beauty yarrow, and other bees preferred the Scarlet Farewell to Spring, versus all those other instances are happening here in the Douglas aster group. And then on the other side, there seems to be a clear preference for the native plant in the Clarkia group, aside from this one exception. So we found that when there was a difference in visitation, bees were more likely to prefer native plants. Here, the difference is 9 to 7, though note that 3 of those cultivar preferences do come from honeybees, which aren't native. And 9 to 7 may not seem like a huge difference, but these are only the results of statistically significant comparisons. And what's statistically significant can sometimes not reflect what's ecologically significant. So if we were to look deeper into these white boxes, we might see some slight preferences for one plant or another. And these trends that we're seeing here are also a little stronger when we include all of the pollinators that we studied, but for time, we're only talking about bees today. Moving into our collection data, across our entire research garden, we collected 70 different bee species. And when we look across our plant groups, we see that the native plant in every group had a greater bee species richness than the cultivars. The magnitude of this difference is a little bit variable. The Douglas asters, again, seem to be a little bit more matched. Versus the native Clarkia had our greatest richness, which was 29 different bee species, compared to its scarlet cultivar, which only had 9 bee species visited. We also collected 5 specialist bee species, but only 3 of them were collected in high abundance, so more than 10 individuals. So we found Melissodes clarkiae, which is a Clarkia specialist, and then Melissodes lupinus and Melissodes microstictus, which are aster specialists. They did visit yarrow a little bit, but not nearly in the abundance that they visited the Douglas aster, which is why we're only talking about Douglas aster here. So each of these species were collected more often from the native plant than any of the cultivars, but again, the magnitude of this difference is variable. So our Clarkia specialists, we collected 11 times more of these specialists off of the native than we did from the second most visited plant, dwarf white, which only had 13. And then kind of on the opposite side, there was only a difference in 10 individuals for Melisodes microstictus visiting the native Douglas aster compared to Savi star, the second most visited Douglas aster. So the general results we have so far are that bees were more likely to prefer native plants over cultivars. Specialists were more likely to be collected from native plants, and the cultivars that were consistently preferred over their native plant types were actually some of the least developed cultivars in our study. The next step for my own research involved exploring what plant traits might be driving those differences in visitation that we've observed. So this is stuff that we're actively working on right now, but don't quite have results for. So we're going to be looking at floral rewards, where we analyze the nutritional content of the pollen from our plants, as well as the quantity of nectar they produce and the sugar content of that nectar. If you've heard me talk before, you've probably heard me mention that leafcutter bees collect petals from Clarkia plants to use in their nests. So one thing that we have looked at already is floral resources of native plants and cultivars by looking at leafcutter bee use of Clarkia. And so when leafcutters come and take petal segments from Clarkia, and the bottom left image here, you see these little crescent shapes that they leave. And so over one season, Mallory Mead, an undergraduate student in our lab, led our team in counting the number of flowers with evidence of leafcutter petal removal across the 4 Clarkia plants we had in our study. And then when we look at the number of flowers that had this characteristic crescent cut shape, we found that the native Clarkia had significantly greater usage by leafcutter bees compared to the 3 cultivars. And though we didn't see any difference in leafcutter bee visitation to these plants, there is a notable difference in usage of the plants for this nesting resource. So leafcutter bees then may be affected by changes in petal and leaf color of their preferred resource plants. Additional components of my research that we're looking at are floral traits, so quantifying the physical differences between native plants and cultivars that it might explain differences in visitation. A couple things are pictured here, which I won't go into too much depth, but we have some graphs of the number of open flowers for Clarkia, just noting quickly here the scale of the axes, so up to 800 for the native one versus Aurora typically had less than 200 flowers open at any time. Svea Breslin, another undergraduate student in our lab, also took bee vision photos of all of our plants in order to see if the plants appear differently to bees. In those cases where, we see a visual difference between a blue and a white flower, but is that the same for bees, which have a very different vision than we do? We also measured plants in terms of the actual size of the flowers. And then one thing that I'm working on right now is quantifying color. And so each of these dots represent a scan of a California poppy petal. So I don't really have much to say about all of this except that it's in progress and hopefully it'll be really cool to tell you about when it's done. So finally, I want to make a few points about cultivars because there is a really big growing misunderstanding about what cultivars actually are. So first, two terms to learn. The first is genotype. A genotype is the genetic constitution of an individual organism or the genes responsible for making a plant a certain way. And then phenotype is the observable characteristics of an organism that result from the interaction between its genotype and the environment. So phenotype are what we can actually see. We can't physically see the genes, but we can see the phenotype that is created by those genes. So here we have two pictures of Douglas aster. The most common native phenotype is on the left, so this purple flower. So if you were going to a store during the time Douglas aster was in bloom and you had to pick out a plant, that is probably what you're looking for. Many plants, though, have naturally occurring variations in their phenotype. A lot of purple flowers, for example, have naturally occurring morphs with white flowers. So on the right here is a white morph of Douglas aster. It's not the most common phenotype that you'll find in wild populations, but it's still a native phenotype for that plant species. And so in our study, we used a cultivar called Savi Snow. A nursery collected seeds from a phenotypically white Douglas aster from Savi Island. They grew them out, and then they gave the plant the name Savi Snow. So Savi Snow is still a wild type native plant. It has a name, it has a cultivar name, but it's just a less common phenotype of Douglas aster. Parentage of cultivars makes a pretty big difference. So this is another example from our study using yarrow. So the cultivar we're going to talk about here is Achillea moonshine. So moonshine is an interspecific hybrid. So its parents are Egyptian yarrow, and then the species we know as yarrow. And to get moonshine, these two plants had to be crossed. But in actuality, it's not quite as simple as the picture here. So this is a ornamentally, horticulturally bred plant. So while Achillea millefolium is in the beginning of moonshine's pedigree, there are a lot of crosses and generations that have happened between the initial cross and with what ultimately became the cultivar moonshine. So to compare these two cultivars, moonshine is a really distant relative of the wild type yarrow. But Savi Snow is actually just as native as the purple Douglas aster we used as the wild type in our study. And so the point that I want to make here is some cultivars are just plants with fun names, while some might be highly bred ornamental variants. And so this makes the whole cultivar controversy a little more complicated because it's often difficult to find out exactly where plants come from, although some cultivars that are selected from wild populations are advertised with their origin story. So cultivars are often really appropriate plants to put in gardens, but your use of them might depend on your gardening goals. So they can provide a source of color or beauty. They may have resistance traits that aren't present in wild or other variants of the species, or they may have been bred to be smaller, which might be more suitable if you don't have a lot of space for plants in your garden. There are some potential ecological concerns with cultivars, those being more highly developed cultivars. And so that first concern is potential value to wildlife, which is the whole point of my study and this greater research on native plants and cultivars. For a lot of plants, we just don't know if the cultivars are as attractive as wild type plants. That's something that we have some ideas about, but there's a lot of nuances. It's not a very clear black and white, one is better answer. The other concern that we want to be aware of is potential spread into wild populations. And this is also a concern with using non-native plants in gardens. So lupins readily hybridize with one another, which has caused issues for the threatened Karner blue butterfly and its host, the eastern wild lupin. So the eastern wild lupin hybridizes with the western big leaf lupin or Lupinus polyphyllus, which is also known as the Russell lupin in horticulture. So these butterflies can only develop if they feed from the eastern wild lupin. They can't tell the eastern lupin from the hybrids, and if they feed on the hybrid plants, they actually fail to develop and die. And note that this example is relevant only for the range of the Karner blue butterfly, which extends from Minnesota to New York. If you have alarm bells going off in your brain because Western lupin is native to Oregon, you can still use Western lupin here in Oregon. We just don't want to plant it outside of its native range. So for an example that's a little closer to home, hybridization has been a concern with a Pacific Northwest lupin as well, although it doesn't have an endangered butterfly host as far as I'm aware. So riverbank lupin or Lupinus rivularis hybridizes with the invasive Lupinus arboreus, and the plant is threatened in the northernmost part of its range, so around British Columbia primarily. And this invasive plant, it's invasive to the Pacific Northwest from British Columbia down to California. I'm not sure exactly its native range, but this is an invasive plant that is sold as both a straight species and as a cultivar, and is actually available to buy from a California-based nursery. So this is my gentle suggestion to be really careful when you plant lupins in particular, but for many other plant species, there's actually very little information about their capacity to spread beyond gardens, and then even beyond that, whether they will cross-pollinate with wild type plants. And so, as we've seen in the literature, there are ecological benefits to cultivars. Some of them are visited more often than their native counterparts. Some of them have traits that are essential for maintaining plant species. And one other thing that we're looking at in our lab is if cultivars or other plants that attract a high abundance, but maybe low diversity of plant pollinators in gardens can potentially consolidate highly competitive pollinators and therefore leave other plants open to a greater diversity of pollinator species. So this is a theory and a whole other can of worms that I'll probably talk about at some point in the future, but so far our results seem promising. But anyway, so getting into major takeaways from this talk. Gardens for bees should seek to use plants that support a high abundance and a high diversity of bee species. Native plants may yield more benefits to bees than cultivars, but cultivars are not without value. And then cultivars that are more closely related to wild type natives tend to be visited more often by pollinators than highly bred cultivars. And finally, there is no one right way to garden. And If you want some additional planting guidance, this is your reminder to check out these two extension documents, which again will be provided in a longer list of resources. And then from my own research, I would in particular highlight all three of the Douglas aster plants that we used, as well as Farewell to Spring and California Poppy. Although note for those two, I would recommend planting the native types because hybridization might be a concern with those two annual plants. And again, if you registered for this webinar in advance, you will be emailed a document containing all of these resources. And if you didn't, I'm going to slowly tap through each of these slides in case you want to pause the recording in the future and type in one of these links. So here's page 1, page 2, and page 3. And then I want to acknowledge all of the people who have helped me with my research so far, including all of the undergraduate students in our lab, past and present. Link identified our bees, and then of course, Gail for taking me on as a student. And my contact information is here, as well as our lab website and our lab blog. And I think we have a good amount of time to go through some questions.
Well, thank you so much for such interesting information, and it's fresh from your research. My guess is not much of this have been included in publications yet, so we have a lot more to look forward to from what you're doing. Just to review, so the best plants that we know from research from Oregon State would be those two extension documents, one on annuals and perennials, the other one on trees and shrubs. Folks are going to get this list. And I used to look up, the best list of pollinator plants from a whole bunch of organizations and, gardening magazines. And later on, I read most of those lists are not based on research, and there is evidence that some of the lists are just copying from other lists. So can you say a little bit more about what you know in terms of the quality of information of these pollinator plant lists out there?
Yeah, I mean, you covered most of it. I would say generally the best sources for that kind of information will be universities or like other organizations like the NRCS, Fish and Wildlife. And in particular with native plants, when we are really thinking about scale, you want to be using something that is not just a North American native plant. And so getting local resources, local planting lists is a little more important than something that is just native to North America.
Now, in terms of whether a plant is native to a geographic area, I know in Oregon, we can use Oregon Flora as a trusted source, but I know in the United States, we can also use a USDA plant database.
Mhm.
I don't think we included a website for that, but maybe we should add that.
So
Do you have a personal experience using both? Is there anything you want to say about which one is better, ease of use, etc.?
Oregon Flora is still being updated, so it doesn't have the range maps for everything. I usually use both.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then there are a lot of questions about how do we know which is really a native plant as opposed to, just by looking at names. So I know you wrote something that summarized, what's in a name when you look at a name to decipher a plant's origin and also how to buy natives. Would you elaborate a little bit the main points from both?
Yeah, so there's a naming convention that we can use to identify cultivars. But of course, it is a little more complicated than that. So often, if something is marketed as a straight species, we would hope that it is a straight species and not a cultivar. So that is maybe the easiest or most direct way to buy a native plant. If you're concerned about it being marketed poorly or like incorrectly, there are some nurseries that verify like the origin of their plants, but going to a native plant nursery will usually be a little bit more specialized, and you will probably have less questions about if a plant is a native type or not. In the case of cultivars of native plants, it requires a lot of research unless the
Mm.
plant has like a website page where its origin is described. And so with Savi Sky and Savi Snow, the nursery we got them from, it says in their description that they are selections from Savi Island. I know there's a couple other ornamental plants that have their, or other cultivars of native plants where it'll say like Gene Sullivan found this plant on the side of this river in Kentucky, and that's like part of the description, but it's not always that clear. Sometimes it takes a little bit of research to figure out whether a cultivar has a cultivar name because it's very different from the native plant, or if it's just a representative of a less common phenotype. So it's not a simple process, but
Yeah,
as we raise these issues and kind of figure out what is being named what, I think hopefully moving forward, plant labeling can hopefully become a little clearer.
yeah, I agree. Um, in your research, have you come upon any resources that clarify among the commonly grown flowering plants in gardens, which ones have better nectar resource or in terms of abundance or quality, and which ones have better pollen resource, also quantity and quality?
Um, so this is an area that is still being actively researched. I know that the Honeybee Lab and um, Priya, who used to work in the Honeybee Lab, is now at Mississippi State. And so they have a collaboration with some funding where they're trying to get the pollen nutrition for a really, really long list of plants. And so that is a resource that I think is going to be coming out in the next 2 years. And I think aside from that, there are scattered papers that have pollen nutrition data, but it's pretty limited. And different bees have different nutritional ratio preferences for pollen too. So again, it's not quite as simple as here are the plants with the most protein because some bees want a little less protein. And then nectar, I also don't know of a great resource that's out there. Um, yeah, I think that's something that's still a little ways away, although typically planting something that produces both nectar and pollen is a great way to just cover both. So things like asters produce nectar and pollen. California poppy doesn't produce nectar, but it produces a lot of pollen. So just making sure that both of those resources are represented in gardens at some capacity is good.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
We have some people who are asking questions about growing California native, which also can grow in gardens in Oregon. What's your view there?
A lot, you gotta decide the scale for yourself. I think, and also like I think many of us probably have non-native ornamentals in our gardens already. So gardens, are spaces that can be for conservation, but they can also have other purposes. Like I'm sure most of us have basil and tomato like getting ready to go into the garden, and neither of those are native to Oregon either, but we aren't going to remove them. So again, it comes down to what your goals with gardening are. If you want to focus on supporting pollinators, including some Oregon natives with other Pacific Northwest native plants, can be a good option, but you don't have to be one or the other. You can have non-natives and natives and things that are almost native, depending on your definition.
Sure. Would you say a little bit about what you know, the relationship between honeybees and native bees? I've heard that honeybees may be keeping native bees from getting enough food if there is too much competition in the garden. What do you know from research?
So this is one of those areas where there is a bit of mixed results, but ultimately it comes down to the abundance of honeybees and the abundance of floral resources. So in areas where floral resources are scarce and there's a lot of honeybees, there is likely going to be competition between wild bees and honeybees. In areas where there are a lot more floral resources to choose from, there could be a little competition, like if you have a tree that is blooming and it's covered in honeybees, that might be like a short-term competition because honeybees have the capacity to communicate with one another about like great floral resources. So they may like monopolize like a big resource. But again, that's less of a concern if there's tons of other things flowering in the landscape. So generally, I would say they can and do compete with native bees in certain spaces.
So the message to gardeners is grow more flowering plants, long season of bloom, abundance as much as possible, but also in diversity, flower
Yeah.
shape, color, etc.
And
Um,
making sure there's more than one thing blooming at a time for each season. And again, this is like if you have the capacity to do that. Maybe you don't. That's also
a couple
fine.
of plants in your presentation that jump out at me. One is the Clarkia. It seems like it just does so many interesting things and it supports specialist bees. So this is something that I made a note I'm going to be growing this year. But if I go to the nursery, buy Clarkia that does not have a cultivar name, because I want the straight species, based on your research, it's supposed to be better. Um, I grow it out. Is the only way I can tell whether it's a straight species when it bloom and by looking at the flower pattern.
That is the easiest way.
Okay.
We have some so we have the native and the cultivars, and there has been some hybridization. We haven't been able to tell if it's just the cultivars crossing with each other or if the native is also crossing with the cultivars. And with some of those, if you've been staring at the plants for 4 years, you can tell by the vegetation because the
Mm,
cultivars, the ones we have at least, um, they're a little shorter and everything about them is a little bigger.
hmm.
But if it's your first time growing a plant, it's probably not going to be super easy to tell unless it flowers.
Okay. So it may be a good idea for me to not grow cultivar and the straight species in a close proximity. If I want to grow Clarkia, I should just try one thing first and gain some experience before expanding.
Yeah,
Is
it's one of those plants where we're a little worried about potential escape from gardens. So prioritizing the native Clarkia would be great. And it is such an interesting and important pollinator plant. So I feel like that's justification enough. And it's a beautiful little pink flower, great cut flower.
Well, I'm looking forward to trying it. Do you know much about Sedosia, which is also a nice native perennial, easy to
Mhm.
grow? Uh, can you give some advice on maybe adding that to the garden?
Yeah, we had Sedalia in my study, but the cultivars turned out to not be related to the native plant at all,
Hmm.
so it got removed. But Sedalia plants have continued to germinate every year, even though we keep removing them. So also great in longevity there. And there are also a few specialists on Sedalia, specialist bees. So it's a nice early spring perennial that is pretty resistant to you trying to remove it and supports some specialists.
That sounds great. I think I'm going to add Sedosia. It's the common name is rose checker mallow,
Hmm.
and Clarkia, the common name is farewell to spring. I think I'm going to add these to my garden this year. Just try a little bit of different things every year to make the garden more pollinator friendly. Any final words for our folks? We're going to be wrapping up this webinar. You talked about looking at pollen, nectar, and flower structure next in your research. Would you say a little bit about what are the main gaps in our understanding of the relationship between bees and flowers, plants?
It's a very complicated story with a lot of asterisks to anything you might find. So I think getting the trait data is going to help us better understand why some patterns might be happening. Um, but yeah, it's a little too early to say anything really.
Okay.
Um, But yeah, it's unclear whether one trait is more important over another. Um, and I think that's going to take a lot of additional research to determine.
And I guess we should wrap up by suggesting everyone to check out the Garden Ecology Lab website, which is gardenecology.oregonstate.edu. We'll put that in our resources because that's where research done by Jen and others associated with the lab will appear over time as the new information becomes available. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And next week, we're going to talk about plants for a non-irrigated landscape before the hot weather comes. That may be useful information for many of us who garden in this area. Thank you very much, Jen, for giving your time and sharing your knowledge today. We have a lot of folks saying how much they enjoy the information. And that's it, folks, until next week.